Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere, many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact. Several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings. Huge as office buildings, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star Sol, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious to their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow somethings went unnoticed at Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woonmera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was the exact sort of thing they'd been looking for all these years. The only place that registered them all was on a small black device called a sub-ether sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Prefect wore habitually around his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he was pretending he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the sub-ether sensomatic and the scripts, he had an electronic thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte, with a couple flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device which looked rather like a largish electronic calculator. This had about 100 flat-press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of a million pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in large friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was in fact the most remarkable of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Beneath that, in Ford Prefect's satchel, were a few biros, a notepad, and a largish bath towel from Marks & Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has great practical use. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moors of Jagl and Beta. You can lie on it in the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Centragonus V, inhaling the heady sea vapors. You can sleep under it beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Cacrifoon. Use it to sail a mini-raft round the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxious fumes or to avoid the gaze of the ravenous, bug-blattered beast of Traal, a mind-bogglingly stupid animal which assumes that if you can't see it can't see you. Daft as a bush, but very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal, and of course, dry yourself off with it if it still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag meaning non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in possession of a toothbrush, face flannel, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might accidentally have lost. What the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still knows where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase which has passed into hitchhiking slang as in, "Hey, you sass that hoopy Ford Prefect. There's a frood who really knows where his towel is." Sass meaning know, be aware of, meet, have sex with. Hoopy meaning really together guy. Frood meaning really amazingly together guy. Nestling quietly on top of the towel in Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-ether sensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow somethings began to fan out. At Jodrell Bank, someone decided it was time for a nice relaxing cup of tea. "Have you got your towel with you?" said Ford Prefect suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked round at him. Why, what? No. Should I have? He had given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. Drink up, he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub, through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer, leapt to his feet. What's that? He yelped. Don't worry, said Ford. They haven't started yet. Oh, thank God for that, said Arthur, relaxed. It's probably just your house being knocked down, said Ford, drowning in his last pint. What? Shouted Arthur. Suddenly, Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. Oh my God, they are! They're knocking my house down! What the hell am I doing in a pub, Ford? Well, it hardly makes any difference at this stage, said Ford. Let them have their fun. Fun? Yelped Arthur. Fun! He quickly checked out of the window again that they were talking about the same time. Damn their fun! He hooted and ran out of the pub furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in the pub at lunchtime. Stop, you vandals! You home-wreckers! Bawled Arthur. You half-crazed Visigoths! Stop, will you? Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. Well, there you go, sir, said the barman, slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you be so kind. Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £5 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be further than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far, so such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was, at this moment, under great stress, and he was born 600 light-years away in the near vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. Are you serious, sir? He said in a small whisper, which had the effect of silencing the pub. You think the world's going to end? Yes, said Ford. But this afternoon. Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippest. Yes, he said gaily. In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate. The barman couldn't believe the conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had just had either. Isn't there something we can do about it, then? He said. No, nothing, said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pockets. Someone in the hushed bar suddenly laughed raucously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes waved their way up to Ford. I thought, he said, that if the world was going to end, we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something. If you like, yes, said Ford. It's what they told us in the army, said the man, and his eyes began the long trek back down to his whiskey. You think they'll help? Asked the barman. No, said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. Excuse me, he said. I've got to go. With a wave, he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour or so, and it would probably have been great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, Last orders, please. The huge yellow machines began to sink downward and move faster. Ford knew what they were, and this wasn't the way he wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. You barbarians! He yelled.
I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered, and whipped and boiled until you've had enough."
Ford was running after him very fast. Very, very fast.
"And then I'll do it again," yelled Arthur. "And when I've finished, I'll take all the little bits and I will jump on them."
Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds, impossibly huge yellow somethings.
"And I will carry on jumping on them,"
yelled Arthur, still running,
"until I get blisters or I can think of anything else even more unpleasant to do. And then—"
Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled and landed flat on his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His fingers shot upwards.
"What the hell is that?"
he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-buggering noise, and leapt off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did the same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say what people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they really didn't know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the sky. All around the world, city streets exploded with people. Cars slewed into each other as the noise fell on them, then rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flatten everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with a terrible sadness in his eyes and rubber bugs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and had known ever since his sub-ether sensomatic had started winking in the dead of night beside his pillow, and woken him with a start. It was what he had waited for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern, sitting alone in his small dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races in the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to planet Earth, he thought, didn't it just have to be the Vogans? Still, he knew what he had to do. As a Vogan craft screamed through the air high above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready, everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the air over every nation on Earth. Motionless they hung, huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the Earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction. The greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. "People of Earth, your attention please," a voice said, and it was wonderful. Wonderful, perfect, quadraphonic sound with distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep.
"This is Prostetnik Vogan Jats of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council,"
the voice continued.
"As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial express route through your star system. And regrettably, your planet has been one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth's minutes. Thank you."
The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled onto the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathering crowds as if they were iron fillings on a sheet of board and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again. Desperate, fleeing panic, but there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on the PA system again. It said,
"There's no point in acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display at your local planning department on Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years. So you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now."
The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted off across the land. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky with easy power. On the underside of each hatchway opened an empty black space. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcasted a message back to the Vogon ships to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said, they only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was annoyed. It said,
"What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in your local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams."
Light poured onto the hatchways.
"I don't know,"
said the voice on the PA.
"Apathetic bloody planet. I've no sympathy at all."
It cut off. There was a terrible ghastly silence. There was a terrible ghastly noise. There was a terrible ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky starry void. Chapter 4. Far away on the opposite spiral arm of the galaxy, 500,000 light-years from the star Sol, Zaphod Beeblebrox, President of the Imperial Galactic Government, sped across the seas of Damagran, his ion-drive delta boat winking and flashing in the Damagran sun. Damagran, the heart. Damagran, the remote. Damagran, the almost totally unheard of. Damagran, secret home of the Heart of Gold. The boat sped across the water. It would be some time before it reached its destination because Damagran is such an inconveniently arranged planet. It consists of nothing but middling to large desert islands, separated by very pretty but annoyingly wide stretches of ocean. The boat sped on. Because of this topological awkwardness, Damagran has always remained a deserted planet. This is why the Imperial Galactic Government chose Damagran for the Heart of Gold project, because it was so deserted and the Heart of Gold was so secret. The boat zipped and skipped across the sea that lay between the main islands of the only archipelago of any useful size on the whole planet. Zaphod Beeblebrox was on his way from the tiny spaceport on Easter Island. The name was an entirely meaningless coincidence. In galactic speak, Easter means small, flat, and light brown. To the Heart of Gold Island, which, by another meaningless coincidence, was called France. One of the side effects of work on the Heart of Gold was a whole string of pretty meaningless coincidences. But it was not in any way a coincidence that today, the day of culmination of the project, the great day of unveiling, the day that the Heart of Gold was finally to be introduced to the marveling galaxy, was also a great day of culmination for Zaphod Beeblebrox. It was for the sake of this day that he had first decided to run for the presidency, a decision that had sent waves of astonishment through the Imperial Galaxy. Zaphod Beeblebrox? President? Not the Zaphod Beeblebrox. Not the president. Many had seen it as a clinching proof that the whole of known creation had finally gone bananas. Zaphod grinned and gave the boat an extra kick of speed. Zaphod Beeblebrox, adventurer, ex-hippie, good-timer, crook, quite possibly, maniac self-publicist, terribly bad at personal relationships, often thought to be completely out to lunch. President? Not one of them had gone bananas. Not in that way, at least. Only 6 people in the entire galaxy understood the principle on which the galaxy was governed, And they knew that once Zaphod Beeblebrox had announced his intention to run as president, it was more or less a fait accompli. He was the ideal presidency fodder. President. Full title: President of the Imperial Galactic Government. The term imperial is kept, though it is now an anachronism. The hereditary emperor is nearly dead and has been so for many centuries. In the last moments of his dying coma, he was locked in a stasis field, which keeps him in a state of perpetual unchangingness. All his heirs are now long dead, and that means without any drastic political upheaval, power has simply and effectively moved a rung or two down the ladder, and is now seen to be vested in a body which is used to act simply as advisors to the emperor, an elected governmental assembly, headed by a president, elected by that assembly. In fact, it vests in no such place. The president in particular is very much a figurehead. He wields no real power whatsoever. He is apparently chosen by the government, but the qualities he is required to display are not those of leadership, but those of finely judged outrage. For this reason, the president has always been a controversial choice, always an infuriating but fascinating character. His job is not to wield power, but to draw attention away from it. On those criteria, Zaphod Beeblebrox is one of the most successful presidents the galaxy has ever had. He has already spent 2 of his 10 presidential years in prison for fraud. Very, very few people realize that the president and the government have virtually no power at all. And of these very few people, only 6 know whence ultimate political power is wielded. Most of the others secretly believe that the ultimate decision-making process is handled by a computer. They couldn't be more wrong. What they completely failed to understand was why Zaphod was doing it. He banked sharply, shooting a wild wall of water at the sun. Today was the day. Today was the day when they would realize what Zaphod had been up to. Today was what Zaphod Beeblebrox's presidency was all about. Today was also his 200th birthday. But that was just another meaningless coincidence. As he skipped his boat across the seas of Damagran, he smiled quietly to himself about what a wonderful, exciting day it was going to be. He relaxed and spread 2 of his arms lazily across the seat back. He steered with an extra arm he'd recently fitted just beneath the right one to help improve his ski boxing. "Hey," he cooed to himself, "you're a real cool boy, you." But his nerves sang a song shriller than a dog whistle. The island of France was just about 20 miles long, 5 miles across the middle, sandy and crescent-shaped. In fact, it seemed to exist not so much as an island in its own right, as simply a means of defining the sweep and curve of a huge bay. This impression was heightened by the fact that the inner coastline of the crescent consisted almost entirely of steep cliffs, and from the top of the cliff the land sloped slowly down 5 miles to the opposite shore. On top of the cliffs stood a reception committee. It consisted of a large part of the engineers and researchers who had built the Heart of Gold. Mostly humanoid, but here and there were a few Reploid Automaneers, 2 or 3 green sylph-like Maxi-Megagalacticans, an octopoid Physicturalist or 2, and a Hulavu. A Hulavu is a super-intelligent shade of the color blue. All except the Hulavu were resplendent in their multicolored ceremonial lab coats. The Hulavu had been temporarily refracted into a freestanding prism for the occasion. The mood of immense excitement thrilled throughout all of them. Together, and between them, they had gone to and beyond the furthest limits of physical laws, restructured the fundamental fabric of matter, strained, twisted, and broken the laws of possibility and impossibility. But still, the greatest excitement of all seemed to be to meet a man with an orange sash around his neck. An orange sash was what the president of the galaxy traditionally wore. It might not even have made much difference to them if they'd known exactly how much power the president of the galaxy actually wielded. None at all. Only 6 people in the galaxy knew the job of galactic president was not to wield power, but to attract attention away from it. Zaphod Beeblebrox was amazingly good at his job. The crowd gasped, dazzled by the sun and seamanship, as the presidential speedboat zipped round the headland into the bay. It flashed and shone as it came skating over the sea in wide skidding turns. In fact, it didn't need to touch the water at all, because it was supported on a hazy cushion of ionized atoms. But just for the effect, it was fitted with thin fin blades, which could be lowered into the water. They slashed sheets of water hissing into the air, carved deep gashes into the sea, which swayed crazily and sank back foaming into the boat's wake as it careered across the bay. Zaphod loved the effect. It was what he was best at. He twisted the wheel sharply. The boat slewed round in a wild sailing skid beneath the cliff face and dropped to rest lightly on the rocking waves. Within seconds, he ran out onto the deck and waved and grinned at over 3 billion people. The 3 billion people weren't actually there, but they watched his every gesture through the eyes of a small robot Tri-D camera which hovered obsequiously in the air nearby. The antics of the president always made amazingly popular Tri-D. That's what they were for. He grinned again. 3,006 people didn't know it, but today would be a bigger antic than anyone had bargained for. The robot camera homed in for a close-up on the more popular of his 2 heads, and he waved again. He was roughly humanoid in appearance, except for the extra head and 3rd arm. His fair, tousled hair stuck out in random directions. His blue eyes glinted with something completely unidentifiable, and his chins were almost always unshaven. A 20-foot-high transparent globe floated next to his boat, rolling and bobbing, glistening in the brilliant sun. Inside it floated a wide, semicircular sofa, upholstered in glorious red leather. The more the globe bobbed and rolled, the more the sofa stayed perfectly still, steady as an upholstered rock. Again, all done for effect as much as anything. Zaphod stepped through the wall of the globe and relaxed on a sofa. He spread his 2 arms lazily along the back, and with the 3rd brushed some dust off his knee. His head looked about, smiling. He put his feet up. At any moment, he thought, he might scream. Water boiled up beneath the bubble. It seethed and spouted. The bubble surged into the air, bobbing and rolling up on the waterspout. Up it climbed, throwing stilts of light at the cliff. Up it surged on the jet, the water falling beneath it, crashing back down into the sea hundreds of feet below. Zaphod smiled, picturing himself. A thoroughly ridiculous form of transport, but a thoroughly beautiful one. At the top of the cliff, the globe wavered for a moment, tipped onto a railed ramp, rolled down it to a small concave platform and riddled to a halt. To tremendous applause, Zaphod Beeblebrox stepped out of the bubble, his orange sash blazing in the light. The president of the galaxy had arrived. He waited for the applause to die down, and then raised his hands in greeting. "Hi," he said. A government spider sidled up to him and attempted to press a copy of his prepared speech into his hands. Page 3 to 7 of the original version were at the moment floating soggily on the Damagran Sea some 5 miles out from the bay. Page 1 and 2 had been salvaged by the Damagran Frond Crested Eagle, and had already become incorporated into an extraordinary new form of nest which the eagle had invented. It was constructed largely of papier-mâché, and it was virtually impossible for a newly hatched baby eagle to break out of it. The Damagran Frond-Crested Eagle had heard of the notion of survival of the species, but it wanted no truck with it. Zaphod Beeblebrox would not be needing his set speech, and he gently deflected the one being offered him by the spider. "Hi," he said again. Everyone beamed at him, or at least nearly everyone. He singled out Trillian from the crowd. Trillian was a girl that Zaphod had picked up recently whilst visiting a planet, just for fun incognito. She was slim, darkish, humanoid, with long waves of black hair, a full mouth, and an odd little knob of a nose, and ridiculously brown eyes. With her red headscarf knotted in a particular way, and her long flowing silky brown dress, she looked vaguely Arabic. Not that anyone had ever heard of an Arab, of course. The Arabs had very recently ceased to exist, and even when they had existed, they were 500,000 light-years from Damagran. Trillian wasn't anybody in particular, or so Zaphod claimed. She just went around with him, rather a lot, and told him what she thought of him. "Hi, honey," he said to her. She flashed a quick, tight smile and looked away. Then she looked back for a moment and smiled more warmly. But by this time he was looking at something else. "Hi," he said to a small knot of creatures from the press, who were standing nearby, wishing that he would stop saying hi and get on with the quotes. He grinned at them, particularly because he knew in a few moments he would be giving them one hell of a quote. The next thing he said, though, was not a lot of use to them. One of the officials of the party had irritably decided that the president was clearly not in a mood to read the deliciously turned speech that had been written for him, and had flipped the switch on the remote control device in his pocket. Away in front of them, a huge white dome that bulged against the sky cracked down the middle, split, and slowly folded itself down into the ground. Everyone gasped, although they had known perfectly well it was going to do that because they had built it that way. Beneath it lay uncovered a huge spaceship, 150 meters long, shaped like a sleek running shoe, perfectly white and mind-bogglingly beautiful. At the heart of it, unseen, lay a small gold box, which carried within it the most brain-racking device ever conceived, a device which made this starship unique in the history of the galaxy, a device after which the ship had been named, the Heart of Gold. "Wow," said Zaphod Beeblebrox to the Heart of Gold. There wasn't much else he could say. He said it again because he knew it would annoy the press. "Wow." The crowd turned their faces back towards him expectantly. He winked at Trillian, who raised her eyebrows and widened her eyes at him. She knew what he was about to say, and thought him a terrible show-off. "This is really amazing," he said. "That is really, truly amazing. That is so amazingly amazing, I think I'd like to steal it." A marvelous presidential quote, absolutely true to form. The crowd laughed appreciatively, the newsmen gleefully punched buttons into the sub-ether newsmatics, and the president grinned. As he grinned, his heart screamed unbearably, and he fingered the small paralyzomatic bomb which nestled quietly in his pocket. Finally, he could bear it no more. He lifted his heads toward the sky, let out a wild whoop in major thirds, threw the bomb on the ground, and ran forward through the sea of suddenly frozen smiles.